This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Today's program is entitled 2018, Changes Coming from the Epicenter. And on today's program, we're going to deal with what is coming on the horizon in 2018, which is there are going to be major changes in this nation and in the world, and you need to be prepared for it. You need to kind of look at this information presented today, as well as additional credible information, and you need to view it as kind of an early warning system, an advance warning system, because the epicenter of the United States of America is being shaken. And as you know, the epicenter of an earthquake is where the central power of the earthquake erupts into the earth. I know because I lived, my home in Southern California existed at that time under one of the two epicenters. It was a dual epicenter earthquake, and that was the Great Northridge earthquake, the one where you see the freeways broken in half and all the other stuff that happened. My house lived on top of the epicenter. My neighborhood was right on top of the epicenter. So I know a little bit what it's like to be awoken or awakened very early in the morning, like 4 o'clock or 4:30 a.m., something like that, to the sound of an explosive noise that is so intense that it is the most deafening, ear-splitting noise you've ever heard in your life. And it literally sounds like a locomotive train. I mean, when they used to let the locomotive trains fly, smashed through your house, and the deafening roar continued. It went on and on and on as the house shook so violently that I thought literally at any second it would buckle, break, and collapse, because you have a sense when you're in a home with an earthquake that is so powerful, and you have a sense of how much the structure can actually take, and it could have buckled at any second. The person who lives next door to me, or who lived next door to me during this earthquake, the middle of their house split in two. So when you went into their kitchen area, which is like the center of the house, you would walk through the front doorway, enter the kitchen area, and you would see a split about anywhere from 6 to 12 inches. The earth had split apart, and you couldn't see anything. I mean, if you aimed a flashlight, you couldn't see how far down this split went. So this was a seismic shift, and it split the house in two. And many other houses were very seriously damaged. And you saw probably many news media reports and pictures of that earthquake. Now, the epicenter is where the primary explosive power of the earthquake erupts. So in the United States of America right now, there is an early warning system surrounding Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and the primary institutions that our founding fathers have set up, which were to be functioning as checks and balances against the abuse of power. Like if any one branch of government, such as the Supreme Court or the judiciary or the president or any other branch of government, got too heady and began to assume too much power for itself, it is the job constitutionally for the other branches of government to keep it in check, to prevent tyranny, to prevent revolution, to prevent dictatorship, and most of all, to protect our Constitution, which is, by the way, the sovereign law of the land. Whenever you hear a judge in the United States of America or a political leader make an announcement, make a pronouncement or whatever, if their announcement or pronouncement or policy or order or whatever is opposed to the written Constitution of the United States of America, then technically and legally it is out of order. And it is the responsibility for the other branches of government to smack it down and to restrain it and get rid of it. But you see, we've had some, what would you call it? Wolves in the chicken house. I know nothing about farming, so that's probably not, I don't think it's wolves in the chicken house, but maybe it is. I don't know. We got some bad critters, let's put it that way, in the chicken house. And they've been there a while. And they were doing just fine, cheating you, cheating me, cheating the American public decade after decade through lying, through deceit, because criminal activity operates best under the cover of darkness and can't stand the light. And that's a spiritual principle too, by the way. The devil goes about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. But the devil, just like a wolf in a chicken house or whatever, the devil prefers to operate in the darkness. And the children of light prefer to operate in the darkness because they're scared that if the light shines upon their activities, they'll be exposed and it'll be out in the open what they're doing. So they have to do it under cover of darkness. You know, when you say deep state, let's analyze the words deep state. First of all, the very concept of a deep state ruling our nation through some kind of shadow government, controlling our politicians, electing our politicians. The very notion of a deep state is, first of all, a complete rebellion against the Constitution of the United States. Our founding fathers deliberately left no room for a deep state of any kind, because the Constitution of the United States of America says we the people are to be the governing force of America. And the people we elect into office are supposed to do what is best for the people under the constraints and laws of the Constitution and Bill of Rights, which are the most unique documents of any nation in the history of mankind and of any nation today. Anybody who bothers to read the Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations, or the Declaration of Human Rights of Europe, which is basically a mirror of the document of the United Nations. Anyone who reads those documents carefully, which is like 0 people in our media, and 0 people in our government, and 0 people in our entertainment industry, and just 0 people everywhere. When you read these documents, which are supposed to be just as good as the U.S. Constitution, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and the European Union Declaration of Human Rights, you read that it's the opposite of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, because it contradicts itself. There are no such contradictions in the U.S. Constitution. And that is because at its very basis, historically, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and the European Union Declaration of Human Rights has blatant and egregious contradictions, which were put in there deliberately because both, listen carefully please, both are documents of deceit. So as you read about all your so-called rights, they're numbered in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you're reading about all your rights, you know, your freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to practice your religion, freedom to speak your mind without fear, you know, your political viewpoints. It sounds real good, doesn't it? It sounds very much like the U.S. Bill of Rights. But I forgot what number it is, as you get down about halfway through the numbered rights, all of a sudden you see this little strange curveball. And I'm paraphrasing, but it says in effect that if you speak out against the UN or any of the UN activities or the UN Convention on Human Rights, if you speak out against it, if you politely criticize it, if you publicly disagree with it or privately disagree with it and you're overheard, if you write an article or do something in social media or make your statement and beliefs known that you are criticizing, let's say you simply say you do an honest analysis of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights versus the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Let's say that's your article and you live in some kind of United Nations country. Okay? Well, guess what happens? Because you dare to disagree with the United Nations, you are subject to massive fines, confiscation of property, jail time, and it goes back retroactively, which means they can reach back, I guess, to your birth and seize everything you own, throw you in jail, fine you, and there's no written standard of how tough these penalties can be. So let's do the math, which obviously half the people in America cannot do the math. Neither can the pseudo-journalists. Let's do the math. Do you have freedom of speech? If in the very document of the United Nations it says if you disagree with them, if you criticize them, we're talking about even in a polite way, you are subject to massive fines, very lengthy, including lifelong prison time, and it's retroactive. They can take everything you got. Now, how could you possibly have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, if you also have that statement? That's just one of several contradictory statements in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. How could you see what that does is it contradicts itself. That means if you really are looking at the document rationally and not like an insane person, you recognize, no, you don't have freedom of speech. You don't have freedom of press. You don't have freedom of religion. You know why? Because if you were to dare speak about it, and you were dare to complain, for example, that Christians are being persecuted more than other religions, and the United Nations is not being fair, that very statement could get you thrown in jail, fined, prison time, thrown in prison forever. I mean, really, so since you have such stiff criminal penalties for exercising the freedoms they just told you had, and then they take them away, you don't have them. It's a lie. Do you understand that? It's a lie. It's a lie. It's based on lies. And that's why the United States has the only unique Constitution and Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence in the history of the world up until the second and up starting at its inception in 1776. So the reason for that is that the American Revolution was unlike any other revolution in the last 200, 300 years. Because the American Revolution was forged by strong Bible-believing Christians, as well as deists, and yes, even some people in the Illuminati. But the final consensus and the input of our strong biblical founding fathers created a uniquely biblical and Christian set of rules and regulations for our nation, including the Constitution, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, the checks and balances of the different branches of government so you wouldn't have tyranny. They thought very carefully, okay, and they're very concerned about tyranny. Why? Because the founding fathers were those of the Pilgrims and Puritans and others who had to escape religious persecution in England and other nations where they were being killed, they were having their property seized, they were being thrown in prison, they were being tortured. And so they came to America, the Pilgrims and Puritans, to escape a bloody, horrific persecution of their faith. And they knew if a dictatorship arose in the U.S., that they would be soon vulnerable to jail, to arrests, to fines, and everything else. So the Founding Fathers, who were very brilliant intellectuals, by the way, they were men who understood science, philosophy, mathematics. They were nothing of the sort of contemporary evangelical Christians who, for the sake of trying to be nice, don't know much about anything. These men were deep thinkers, okay? They knew fluently, all of them, because they were all homeschooled. They fluently understood Greek, Hebrew, Latin, the sciences, advanced mathematics, the teachings of the great philosophers, and world history. So because of that, this biblical worldview is etched all over our documents. Therefore, in the Declaration of Independence, it says, "For the Creator has given us certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That simply means that the biblical Creator has given us our rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No other constitution on planet Earth has ever had a statement where you're guaranteed the pursuit of happiness. That comes from a biblical worldview. Number two is inalienable means that it was given; these rights were given to you by God. Therefore, no government has the right to take them away. And so they instituted protective laws in the Bill of Rights, such as you have freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. That's just some of the freedoms you have, and they're protected. Nobody can arrest you, fine you, or whatever for practicing your freedoms. You're protected by supposed to be protected by the highest laws of the land. And then the reason the Founding Fathers put in the checks and balances in the branches of government is they didn't want tyranny, totalitarianism. And that's also the number one reason why they gave you rights such as the right to bear arms. You really must understand, and help your friends who probably don't understand, educate them to understand that the reason that the Founding Fathers gave the people, we the people, the right to bear arms was not for burglaries and home invasions. There were very few, next to none, in terms of burglaries and home invasions, by the way. Just so you know, that was basically non-existent. You know why? It was a Judeo-Christian society. They weren't raised under evolution, so they didn't have those things. So the Founding Fathers' primary purpose in giving we the people the right to bear arms was totally to protect us from totalitarianism and tyranny on the part of government. If government began to trample upon the Constitution and break the Constitution and started to become a totalitarian dictatorship, the Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that the people were adequately armed so they wouldn't be mowed down like they were in communist Russia, communist China, and every other communist nation and dead. They wanted to make sure the people could have a resistance to tyranny and many other laws like that. In distinct contrast, the governing documents in the United Nations and the European Union come out of the French Revolution. And the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution is the French Revolution, man is God. Okay? Logic and reason, and man is God. So it's a man-centered society, a man-centered government. And in every single revolution that flowed philosophically from the French Revolution, you've had a total of about 250 million deaths, mass starvations, communist regimes, National Socialist, Nazi regimes. You've had bloodshed, horror, starvation, and total stripping away of human rights and treating people like animals if they're lucky. That is the result of man being at the center of a nation or a society. The fundamental difference between our laws and Constitution is that it's God-centered. It's the Creator that has given us certain inalienable rights, not man. And therefore, since they're inalienable by our own Constitution, they cannot be taken away legally by our government. So right now, we're in the greatest crisis America's been in. And if you simply research history, if you research things like the governing documents of America versus the governing documents of the UN and the European Union, if you research and just observe the behavior of the media, the behavior of many of our government agencies, especially in those that are called the deep state, which, by the way, a deep state is a flagrant violation of the Constitution. There's no place for a deep state in the Constitution of America. If a deep state exists, as many have alleged, then our nation has already been subverted from within to a large degree. You see, we're deep into this. You know why we're deep into it? We're deep into it because the majority of our brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ over the last 200 years have been sound asleep. Sound asleep. That's why we need a great awakening. A great awakening. You only need a spiritual awakening if the people are asleep spiritually. And true Christians, like our founding fathers, understood that true spirituality involves all of life, not just, prayer meetings and fasting and stuff like that. It involves all of life. And therefore, if our founding fathers were awake, that was a product of the first Great Awakening. But there was a second Great Awakening, and then God's people went to sleep. And that meant they were no longer vigilant. And the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. But in order to be vigilant, you have to be awake. They were deliberately asleep. They closed their eyes to the obvious. The watchmen that blew the shofars and the trumpets of warning in the form of books and lectures and radio broadcasts, etc., they became stiff-necked, hardened their hearts, and refused to listen. Because this train, my friend, has been coming down the track for over 200 years, visible for all to see. This is nothing happening in secret. It was done right out in the open. It's people chose not to see it, because if they chose to see it, then they would have to man up, woman up, and actually do something about it. But no, they wanted to play it easy. So because of their sin of selfishness and cowardice, you and I are at the tipping point. Do you understand that? I'm giving you straight talk. I'm giving you a rational explanation for why things are the way they are. But I'm not trying to frighten you. I'm simply trying to share with you that this is it, man. This is a reality check. Do I like it? No. Would I prefer to put my head in the sand like an ostrich? Yeah, you bet I would. But I can't. You know why I can't? For the same reason you can't. Otherwise, you wouldn't be listening to me. You would turn it off immediately because it would convict you, and you would run and find some big marshmallow to stick your head in and pretend you were worshiping Jesus, but in reality, you were worshiping at a pagan altar called the marshmallow. That's, satire. Okay, so let's get down to business. Why should we get down to business, by the way? Why should we get down to business? Because Jesus Christ's command to us, it wasn't his request. He wasn't hinting. Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's God Almighty. He's the supreme being. He commanded us, his church, to be awake, to be salt and light. And he commanded us before his return to occupy the land that he has given us, to occupy the land. And when I made the remark about getting down to business, those of you that listen to this program know that Jesus Christ, another translation of the words occupy until I come, another translation is do business until I come, kingdom business. So we're at the threshold because of the collective sin of Christians. And even up to this moment, we all share. Let's not kid ourselves. We all share. Me too. Yes, that's right. Paul McGuire shares in this collective sin too. We all share, to varying degrees, a sin of the great sin of omission and the great sins of commission. We all share in that. And repenting of being apathetic is not enough. There must be repentance and then a change of direction. Otherwise, we're making a mockery out of God. So the wolves are at the door. You understand that, right? The wolves are at the door. You know what that means. Well, what it means is the wolves are at the door. And the wolves are very ferocious animals that can tear your throat out. Okay? I'm telling you an accurate description of what wolves do because I want you to be wide awake. But not to scare you, because if I scare you, then I paralyze you. If I paralyze you, then I fail as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So the goal is for me to communicate the truth as effectively as I can, but with the net effect that my communication energizes you with the power of God and the authority of Jesus Christ, and imparts into you the knowledge about how to make the transformation that God has placed before us, so the wolves will retreat from your door, and we keep this whole thing from becoming the what was that? The Titanic. When I watched the movie Titanic, I had an eerie feeling, very eerie feeling the whole time I watched it. I kept getting the sense that I was watching the United States of America. This proud, huge ship. Oh no, nothing could sink it, but it sank anyway. So, many things can sink America. Let's not deceive ourselves. Okay, so what do? We have to understand where we are in time and history. I'm not telling you this to sell you a book. There's lots of books to buy, and there's many good books to buy. I believe it's essential, whether you borrow it or buy it. That's up to you. I believe it's absolutely essential for you to read Trumpocalypse, the book that I wrote with Troy Anderson and myself. Many major Christian leaders have said to us they believe this book has the power to change the direction of this nation, and other things that were very forceful but complimentary. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because I don't want you to think that, oh, gee, he's trying to sell his book. I want you to read the book because it contains the research, the arguments, both theological and practical, of what's happening in our nation, where we're going, and what you can do about it. That's why I would like you to read the book. The people on the left, the book wasn't even out yet, and they caught a couple of minutes of Troy and I doing like a teaser interview on the book Trumpocalypse on Tom Horn's Skywatch TV. And the big guns from the left-wing activists, you know, the ones financed by billionaire, multi-millionaire money, man, we were on their radar screen immediately. And they attacked it, and they demonized it, and they spread it far and wide to their large network of radical leftist activists. They targeted the book. Now, let me ask you a question. If the book was not, if Trumpocalypse was not a threat to their agenda, do you think they would have devoted so much energy and time to attacking our book. Because, see, by attacking our book, they run the risk that they are publicizing it. So why did they run the risk of publicizing our book? Because they consider it a threat to their game plan, their agenda. Now, if they consider it a threat to their game plan and agenda, I would simply say to you, what is it in the book? What information does the book contain that is such a threat to them? And I shouldn't have to answer that to you, because that should tell you that it's important for you to read and help promote. Because if it wasn't a threat to the enemies of the gospel of Jesus Christ, then they wouldn't have attacked. They don't waste their time. Do you think that the left is very sophisticated and very intelligent about what they do? They don't waste their time attacking things that are not going to affect them. That was their first volley, a preemptive strike. That's just the first volley. And then you need to realize this. It has become public knowledge over the last number of months that numerous best-selling books, numerous, that I don't know what's the maximum number of stars you can get. I think it's 5 stars. I'm not sure. And supposedly it's contingent on the quality of your reviews. So there's a whole bunch of authors who have written very good books, from a conservative perspective or a Christian-based perspective. And they were flying very high in the rankings for the book because they got a lot of great reviews. But then bots, computer bots, also rooms of people that are hired by leftist activists that are mobilized through their own network. One guy, best-selling author, was sharing how when he went to bed in the evening, his book had been a major bestseller for like weeks, let's say 3 weeks to a month since it's been out. And it was all driven by the positive reviews of people who read the book. And so he went to bed, and it was like very high, number 1, I believe, in reviews. And when he woke up in the morning at like 6 a.m., he went to bed like at 3 p.m. And it was like number 1 on everything. He woke up at 6 a.m., so I guess he got 3 hours of sleep. And he saw that 30, listen to the number, 30 highly, highly negative reviews somehow mysteriously appeared from the middle of nowhere and crashed, knocked two stars out of his favorability rating. Now, there's no way that he could have had that many positive reviews that earned him a 5-star rating. And then in a period of 3 hours in the middle of the night when no one's paying attention, a whole bunch of reviews appear that are totally negative. That is not a natural phenomenon. That was the result of computer bots and activist teams targeting him for his beliefs that are not politically correct. He's a conservative, and just doing what they can to destroy the book. You see? That's what they do. They don't believe in free speech. So this man is relatively wealthy, and so he hired a team to track down the people who I don't know how he did this, but somehow, because he had the money and contacts, to track down the people, these mysterious people that wrote all these negative reviews. I think there were about 30 negative reviews, which is a lot in 3 hours. And it's a lot when all the reviews prior to that were positive. And he tracked them down, and he discovered that none of these negative reviews were from people who really bought the book. The way it's supposed to work is that people buy the book and they give it a positive or negative review. These people were obviously fed some kind of fact sheet, 2 or 3 pages, and blasted the book with negative reviews. But not one of the 30 actually bought the book. Whereas all the people who gave it a positive review didn't buy, all the people who gave it a positive review did buy the book. So this was a rigging. This is a rigging. In the same way you look across the media and the alternative media and blog sites and websites and YouTubes and rankings and ratings and views and hits and all the rest of that stuff, you will see, starting from it started 2 years ago, but it keeps accelerating. I know of many reputable conservative radio broadcasters on the internet, blog sites, websites, internet, YouTube things, social media, all kinds of things, okay? And many of these rely on internet advertising. And I have seen, because I've been on some, so occasionally I look at, how many people or views they have. And I can say across the board, at a very minimum, every conservative or Christian social media, internet, YouTube, or whatever you want to call it, radio, whatever it is, I've noticed across the board an average of about 60 to 70% negative hit and a rigging of their rankings. So all of a sudden, these programs and blog sites and everything else are all super successful, okay? And then mysteriously, incrementally, they're all slashed by about 70%. Some less, some more. And I know people, they're doing the same thing. They were on a upward trend. They've expanded. Their audiences are just as big as ever. I know one person who runs a very powerful, effective YouTube site who's a Christian. And this particular individual was attacked so hard, she found herself censored. For what? For certainly nothing scandalous. It was the same stuff she was doing for the previous 5 years. They did it so her advertisers, she would lose all her advertisers. So by rigging this, they destroyed her advertising base, as they did many, many others. You see, this is a war. And the people on the other side, unfortunately, many of them are very high up in the social media and internet companies. There was a very important article that I'm going to devote a show on that came out about 4 days ago, in which it discussed a number of very well-known social media companies, internet search engines, and social media type companies, okay? And the interesting thing is that it was discovered and it was leaked out by people who were like high level executives. I mean, not the top or head, but close to the top or head of these social media and internet companies. And they leaked out the truth and said that these internet and social media companies are working in conjunction with the deep state, and they are censoring, they are killing the rankings, they are removing the very existence of anybody who's trying to say anything. The average Facebook user, for example, the average social media user, as well as people who communicate to large numbers, they have bots that are designed to censor, shut down, and block the flow, block the spreading, block the appearance, and remove any kind of content that would be, let's say, pro-Trump, pro-Christianity, not politically correct, conservative, not, for the radical leftist agenda. They're attacked, removed, demonized, and wiped out. Now, it is growing at such an alarming rate I don't have time to get into it in this program. But given the present rate of acceleration, and that happens to be full speed ahead on their part, they will dominate social media and the internet. And I hope you remember what I said, and I hope you act on it. If they are successful in doing this, and they're successful at the moment, you're going to wake up a lot sooner than you think. And there will be no conservative, no Christian voice allowed. It'll all disappear unless it's watered down beyond recognition. That's their game plan, just like communist China and other communist nations. But they have happy phases. They act all nice and cute and cuddly to the American public. But you better remember that some of these people who head up these companies, like, I'll give you an example. One of the founders of Google, Eric Schmidt, he works for the Department of Defense. He shows up at Bilderberg. He's a hardcore globalist. Why does he work at the Department of Defense? To defend our national cyber thing? Yeah, that sounds believable, but it's deeper than that. Because when you have a deep state, you need to have an Orwellian control over the media. That's how you destroy your enemies. And they perceive Christians and conservatives as their enemies. You understand how serious this is? This is not a game. It's not a game. This is the real deal. Now, the Lord is still Lord. Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. As we explain with enormous documentation and enormous quotes that are impeccable. So nobody can rip through the book and say, well, this isn't true, because it's all documented. In Trumpocalypse, as we explain in great detail, we believe that God has given America a temporary reprieve through the election of Donald Trump, who is an imperfect man. But as we explain, the Bible, God used imperfect men throughout history to deliver his people. So let's get over the bad theology, and let's get over the lazy Bible study habits, because the only person that would say, I can't support Donald Trump because of his vulgarity or whatever, or I can't support Donald Trump because he doesn't, match my legitimate Christian checklist of what a Christian should be like. Okay, that's fine. Okay, we're not advocating vulgarity. We're not advocating anything that's not biblical. I'm not personally, even claiming that he's born again. He may well be born again, but I'm not going around saying he's born again. I don't know. I have no idea what the real truth is. But I am saying this. If you're going to be biblical, you need to read the story, for example, just for starters, the story of Daniel, the prophet, who prophetically counseled the king of Babylon, the most ungodly, sexually immoral, pagan empire in the history of the world. Okay? You think Trump's vulgarity, he was vulgar? It's nothing compared to the king of Babylon. The same with Joseph, who became the senior economic advisor to Pharaoh in Egypt under the Pharaoh God-King system. The Pharaoh and the king of Babylon were both worshipped as gods. The sexual immorality, the paganness, the occult, witchcraft, and Satanism in these kingdoms was rampant. Okay? Yet God used those two kings to deliver God's people. And there are numerous other similar accounts in your script in the Bible. Therefore, you cannot make the biblical case that you can't support him because he's not totally Christian. First of all, God raises up everybody that is in power to be in power, including God raised up Obama, God raised up Bush, God raised up Clinton. But not all of the people he raises up responds to his call. So there's a perfect, legitimate biblical reason why you can support a president who does not behave, think, act, or talk as Christian as you would like. That doesn't mean we're endorsing those things or saying that we're good. They're good. No, we're not saying that. But we have to understand that sometimes God delivers his people, and many times throughout history, through kings, presidents, and others that are not Christians, or even necessarily in the Old Testament, they didn't even acknowledge the real God. Although the king of Babylon did acknowledge the real God through Daniel, and then backslid, and then we know that the king of the Pharaoh of Egypt acknowledged God. We don't know if he acknowledged him in the same way that the king of Babylon did. So that's an important thing to understand. So we have a reprieve. A reprieve means none of God's prophetic words that he has outlined in the scripture, everything God has predicted and written about specifically in scripture and in prophecy will come to pass exactly as God said it would in the Bible. So you have to understand, God's word will come true where he speaks on something clearly, okay? I don't think God speaks about the future of Iceland, at least in the short term. So Jesus said, occupy until I come. So this occupation means driving the powers of darkness out with your spiritual weapons by your civic duty, by doing business until I come, the same thing, but both of these things including winning souls to Christ, evangelizing the lost, intercessory prayer, and purging a nation of wickedness, and standing up for your God-given rights. Because you need to understand that your rights were God-given. They are a blessing. They are a heritage given to you by the Pilgrims and Puritans who entered into a covenant with Almighty God in the early 1600s in America. The Pilgrims and Puritans, great men of God, entered into a covenant with God based on the covenant God made with Israel in Deuteronomy 28, the blessings and the curses. So our entire legacy is an inheritance that comes from godly men. It's an inheritance of the blessing of God on our nation. So how dare Christians stand up, mock, despise, and scoff at the inheritance of the blessing of God upon our nation? Do you think it's an accident we have the greatest, or had, hopefully it'll recover, the most vibrant economy in the history of mankind? We had, up until recently, the only significant numerically middle class that was prosperous. The vast majority of nations have never had a middle class. It's slaves and kings. That's how unique America is. And if you notice what the globalists are doing, if you're paying attention, if you're brainwashed by the mainstream media and CNN and whatever this idiot is, Colbert or whatever, what a Manchurian candidate this guy is. You say that's mean. No, I don't think it's mean. I think it's accurate. The blessing of God in the first verse of the blessings and curses of Deuteronomy 28, which the Pilgrims and Puritans entered into, God said, in effect, that if his people would only worship the true God and not the God of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the biblical God, that if God's people worshiped the true God and did not worship the pagan gods, and if God's people hearkened diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, which means reading the word and obeying the word and acting on the word, In the first verse of this covenant, it says that if God's people will do those two things, that God will raise that nation up above all the nations on planet Earth. That has only happened to two nations in the history of the world, Israel and the United States of America. That's why American exceptionalism just happens to be a viable truth as long as it's integrated with the truths of the covenant the Pilgrims and Puritans made. So that's why we had a vibrant middle class. That's why we've had incredible freedoms. That's why we had the Bill of Rights with all these freedoms. That's why the Bill of Rights is still protecting us despite the fact we're under attack. That's why we were the militarily, up until recent, well, we still are, the most powerful nation on earth militarily. That's why we were blessed. That's why every innovation, invention, technology, science, just about, with few exceptions, originated out of America. It's the blessing of God that caused America to become America, not our virtue, not our hard work. Why? Why did God do that? Well, first of all, he did it because the Pilgrims and Puritans entered into a covenant with him based on the covenant the children of Israel entered into with God in Deuteronomy 28. That's the first reason. But the second reason is God wanted to raise up a nation in the last days and in the time period approaching the last days, which would still be a shining light, a city on a hill, for all the nations to be impacted by the light of Christ. God planned for America, at least before the return of the Lord, would be the launching pad for a last days soul harvest, global evangelism, making disciples of all nations. And that's why God blessed America with a unique economy, unique laws, the unique American mindset. You know, we can do anything. It's not necessarily pride. That's a can-do attitude. Because it's the intention of God in the last days to use America to hold back the forces of darkness. But it has to be done first internally, or you're not going to hold back anything. You're not going to hold back the powers of darkness externally if you can't hold them back internally. Now, that doesn't mean that at some period, this reprieve, this time of grace, is not going to end, because the Bible also says that there's going to be a certain point that the entire world comes under a global government with an antichrist, a false prophet, the mark of the beast, so on and so forth. But that hasn't happened yet. So we're to be faithful, occupy until he comes, do kingdom business till he comes. Now, because of the slothfulness of our spiritual forefathers in recent generations and in this generation, the wolves are at the door. They should not have been at the door, because God's people decided to ignore the numerous watchmen that God raised up through media, through books, other means. And the biblical watchman, his job, in some cases her job, is to stay in a high tower so you can see a long distance above the camp of Israel. And if you see the enemy coming from a distance to destroy the camp of Israel, the job of the watchman is, first of all, to be alert, not fall asleep, stay awake, and blow the shofar or the trumpet when he first sees the enemy coming towards the camp of Israel, in order to rouse the camp of Israel to prepare themselves militarily to defeat the oncoming enemies of God and maintain their ground, occupy their land. Okay? And the watchman is accountable for that. If the watchman fails to notice the advancing army, if the watchman falls asleep, or if the watchman fails to blow the trumpet in time to warn the people, and the people are slaughtered, God says to the trumpet, then I hold the watchman responsible for the blood. The watchman is totally responsible for the bloodbath that occurs because he fell asleep. But then God says, if the watchman's faithful, stays awake, he sees the enemy coming from a distance, and then he blows the trumpet in time. But God's people in the camp of God ignore the repeated blowing of the shofar, the repeated blowing of the trumpet, and they just like fall back asleep. Then when the enemy comes and slaughters them, God says, the blood will be upon their own hands. And that truth is applicable today. We are at the moment, at this very second, you are listening to one of many. Many in previous generations and many in our generation. Many people that you know. But at this moment, you're listening to one watchman. There are others. There are many other faithful watchmen. You're listening to one right now. And you are either responding to the trumpet, which you just heard in a verbal discourse, designed to prepare you so you would rouse yourself up and so that the enemy would not destroy you, because that is not the will of God. Or you're going to ignore it and allow your friends to ignore it, and then destruction comes. That's it. You got to be an adult. And I say this to you, my motivation is love, not arrogance. I say this out of love. If I didn't love you, and I didn't care for you, and your children and grandchildren, then I would be selfish, think only of myself, and shut my mouth, and play it safe and lie low, like so many others do. But I can't sleep at night. I am blowing the trumpet as best I can. And I will continue to blow it. It will be unrelentless. Because the purpose of blowing the trumpet implies that God is ready to move on behalf of his people. And that, on behalf of his people, we can win the battle at this very moment. This battle that we're in at this moment can be turned around. There can be a turning of the tide of the battle. And if you have allowed your mind to be polluted by satanic propaganda within the church as well as outside of the church, if you've allowed your mind to be poisoned by the satanic psychological operations convincing you it's too late for America, we're doomed, we're all going to be lined up in concentration camps or re-education camps. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. You know what that thinking does? It paralyzes you. And the Lord does not send his servants to paralyze his people, because if you paralyze the people of God, their destruction, their death is a certainty. You blow the trumpet to rouse them for the purpose of defending themselves, so there is no destruction, so there is no Holocaust. And then you take the land, which is occupying the land. You stop being this Pillsbury doughboy type of evangelical where you stick your finger in the Pillsbury doughboy's belly and he giggles that cute little effeminate laugh. You weren't created to be a Pillsbury doughboy. You were created to be a man or a woman. And since so many men are feminized, women, you better stand up. And you can use your intelligence, law-abiding, peaceful, wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove. Be strategic. Be wise. Don't do a thing unless you've calculated the cost and you know it's effective. We don't need emotionalism. We don't need breaking of the law. We don't need insanity. We need rational, decisive, strategic actions that produce results, that are legal and law-abiding. God bless you. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. and we'll have more information for you very soon. God bless you. I'm Paul McGuire. Spread this far and wide, please. PaulMcGuire.us.